I'm glad to welcome you to the channel Bedtime Chronicles. Why do sacred texts, generally considered to be mere collections of prayers, contain precise descriptions of flying machines capable of entering outer space? How could people of the Bronze Age possess knowledge about the consequences of radiation poisoning? Details they set out with frightening accuracy in myths about the weapons of the gods. And the main question, what if the 4 Vedas known to the entire world are merely the publicly accessible, safe version? Where then are the others? The ones deemed too dangerous for humanity? This is just a small fraction of the mysteries we will dive into today. So, get comfortable, because thanks to our lecture, you are guaranteed to fall asleep. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other stories hidden on the fringes of official science. We will not speak of the Vedas in the way customary in university lecture halls. We will not analyze them as a monument of literature. Instead, we will try to read what is written between the lines and piece together a history that has been hidden for centuries. The official chronology of events always looks very neat, almost sterile. In such and such a century, a culture arose, left behind certain artifacts, and then sank into oblivion, giving way to the next. Everything is logical, everything is sequential, but beneath this smooth flooring of the official version, there are always currents that disturb the peace. The Vedic texts, or the Vedas, are one of these deep and dark currents. It is generally accepted that the Vedas are collections of sacred hymns that form the basis of Hinduism. The oldest and most authoritative of these collections, the Rig Veda, is dated by scholars to roughly the 2nd millennium BC. And essentially, academic science puts a period there. An ancient collection of religious texts, an interesting monument of literature and mythology. However, the Vedic tradition itself offers a completely different, far more disturbing and incredible version of its origin. The key concept here is apaurusheya. This Sanskrit term literally means not of human origin. The Brahmins themselves, the keepers of this knowledge, have insisted for millennia that the Vedas were not composed, not invented. They were heard or seen by ancient sages, who were called rishis. These rishis were not writers or poets in our understanding. They were ascetics, practitioners who withdrew to secluded places, into the deep caves of the Himalayas, into the thick of impassable forests, to the banks of now vanished rivers. There, through complex practices of self-control, meditation and detachment, they brought their consciousness to a state where it became a kind of receiver. And in this state, knowledge descended upon them, not in the form of a structured book, but in the form of sound vibrations, rhythmic structures, mantras. These mantras, woven into hymns, made up the corpus of the Vedas. Tradition calls this divine revelation. But let's set aside the usual religious interpretation for a moment and ask a simple question. If the knowledge was non-human, then whose was it? Official doctrine, both religious and scientific, offers its convenient answers. But there is another version, one not customarily spoken of in polite academic society. A version that turns ancient sages into operators of complex receiving equipment, and gods into something completely different. This hypothesis suggests that the knowledge encrypted in the Vedas has an extraterrestrial origin, that the rishis, in their altered states of consciousness, were not communicating with disembodied spirits, but were connecting to a source of information, a communication channel, broadcasting data from a civilization immeasurably ahead of humanity in development. It sounds like science fiction. But let's turn to the texts themselves. The Rig Veda is full of descriptions that are extremely difficult to interpret as simple mythological allegories. They are too detailed, too technological. Take, for example, the description of Vimanas, the flying chariots of the gods. These are not merely poetic images of winged wagons. The texts contain astounding details. They speak of Vimanas made of shining metal, capable of moving at the speed of thought, rising high into the sky, and even exiting it into space. Some of them are described as multi-level, glowing, emitting a hum or a melodic sound. In the Samarangana Sutradhara, a later text, but one based entirely on Vedic sources, whole chapters are devoted to the description of Vimanas. It speaks of materials for their construction, principles of propulsion, and even energy sources, one of which is vaguely termed a mercury vortex. It mentions Vimanas capable of becoming invisible, hovering in one spot, and performing sharp maneuvers inaccessible to any modern aircraft. Official science dismisses this, calling it all poetic imagination. But imagination must be based on something. People of the Bronze Age, whose main vehicle was a cart drawn by oxen, could hardly have invented the concept of a controlled aircraft with such scrupulous accuracy and with such characteristics. This is not like a myth about a flying carpet. It looks like an attempt to describe technology whose operating principle was completely incomprehensible to the observer. Or let's look at the gods. The chief god of the Rig Veda is Indra, the king of gods, the thunderer. His main weapon is the Vajra. It is usually translated as a lightning bolt or a club, but descriptions of the Vajra in hymns force one to doubt such a simple interpretation. It is described not as a natural phenomenon, but as a manufactured metallic device with 100 angles and 1,000 teeth which Indra holds in his hand. When he uses the Vajra, it flies with a terrifying roar, emits blinding light, and strikes enemies with absolute precision. It is capable of splitting mountains, changing the course of rivers, and destroying entire fortresses. One hymn tells how Indra, using the Vajra, fights the demon Vritra, who blocked the flow of rivers. This battle is described not as a duel between two mythical creatures, but as a large-scale operation using a weapon of colossal destructive power. After Vritra's defeat, the waters rush back into their channels. Is this not an image of terraforming, or a large-scale engineering operation, described in the language of myth? The rishis themselves who received this knowledge were not random people. They were individuals with special psychophysiological data who, through years of training, developed the ability to perceive these transmissions. Their retreat into the mountains and forests was not just an escape from the world, it was a conscious choice of places with specific characteristics. Ancient texts speak of places of power, where the veil between worlds becomes thin. From the point of view of modern physics, these could be zones with special geomagnetic fields, with increased or decreased background radiation, or unique geological faults. Such places do exist. They can affect the functioning of the human brain, inducing altered states of consciousness, auditory and visual hallucinations. Perhaps these forbidden places of power were not just dots on a map, but a kind of stationary relay station. Imagine a network of beacons left by an ancient civilization. These beacons are still active, but to receive their signal, a special receiver is needed. a consciousness prepared by years of austerity and meditation. The rishis, intuitively or by someone's prompt, found these places. The Himalayas, with their huge deposits of quartz and unique tectonic activity, are an ideal candidate for the role of such a natural relay complex. The texts mention the mysterious Saraswati River. In the Rig Veda, it is described as the greatest of rivers, full-flowing, running from the mountains to the ocean. The Vedic civilization flourished on its banks. The main rituals were performed there. There, the rishis received their revelations. However, today, there is no such river. For a long time, it was considered mythical, but satellite imagery and geological studies have confirmed, in ancient times, a huge river indeed flowed in this place, which then dried up or went underground as a result of tectonic shifts. What if the civilization transmitting the knowledge was based precisely there, along the banks of the Saraswati? And the rishis were not just hermits, but students undergoing training in special centers located in these places of power. Then the disappearance of the river and the subsequent decline of civilization explain why the knowledge reached us in such a fragmentary, encrypted form. A catastrophe occurred. The transmitter was damaged or destroyed, and only fragments of broadcasts remained, recorded and preserved by the last students. Traces of paleo contact are scattered throughout Vedic texts. One only needs to change the angle of vision to see them. Take the divine twins, the Ashvins. In myths, they appear as healers, saviors possessing incredible abilities. They restore sight to the blind, reattach severed limbs, and save the drowning on their miraculous ships. One myth tells how the Ashvins restored youth to the sage Chyavana, who had become decrepit and lost his strength in deep old age. The description of the procedure is striking. They immersed the old man in a certain body of water, a font, and he emerged young and full of strength. One could consider this a fairy tale, or one could see it as a description of a complex medical procedure, possibly related to genetic engineering or regenerative medicine, retold in language accessible to people of that era. In another myth, they attached a metal leg to Queen Vishpala to replace one lost in battle, and this prosthesis was so perfect that she could continue to fight. For the Bronze Age, the very idea of a functional prosthesis seems fantastic. Even the structure of Vedic knowledge itself prompts reflection. It is incredibly systematized. The hymns of the Rig Veda are grouped into 10 books, or mandalas. This structure is subject to strict rules. The number of hymns, their arrangement, even the number of syllables in each line, everything matters. This is not a chaotic collection of folk songs. It is an ordered database. The sound of mantras is a separate, vast topic. Brahmins have always insisted that it is not so much the meaning of the words that is important, but their precise phonetic reproduction. It is believed that the correct pronunciation of a mantra creates a certain vibration in space, capable of influencing reality. What is this, if not a conception of sound as technology? Perhaps mantras are not prayers, but a kind of sonic keys, commands that activate certain processes embedded in the very structure of space-time. And the rishis did not compose them, but precisely read or heard them as the basic harmonics of the universe. All this runs counter to the comfortable and simple picture of the world. It is much easier to consider ancient people primitive and naive, and their texts mere collections of fairy tales. To admit that thousands of years ago a technology existed on Earth comparable to or even surpassing ours implies the need to rewrite the entire history of humanity, and that is profitable for no one. Official science is a very inert system. It is built on a specific foundation, and to knock even one stone out from under it means to jeopardize the entire building. Therefore, mentions of Vimanas are interpreted as poetry, descriptions of the weapons of the gods as metaphors for thunderstorms and lightning, and striking astronomical knowledge encrypted in the Vedas, such as mentions of the orbital periods of distant planets, are declared random coincidences or late insertions. But there are too many random coincidences. They form a system that points to the fact that in deep antiquity, humanity encountered something or someone, and this encounter forever changed the course of its development. It left behind a strange and beautiful monument, the Vedas, not a book written by humans for humans, but rather an instruction manual for the universe received from the outside, an instruction manual that we, over thousands of years, have never been able to fully decode. These forbidden places of power, where the first mantras were received, were not always uninhabited. There are legends about entire academy cities hidden in the mountains or in valleys that are now considered uninhabited. For example, legends of Gyanganj, a mystical city of sages hidden somewhere in Tibet, which exists in another dimension and reveals itself only to the chosen. Or the mention of the northern ancestral home of the Aryans, the land of Shvetadvipa, the island of light, where sages lived, who communicated with the gods directly. Perhaps these are not just myths, but distorted memories of real scientific or educational centers where knowledge transfer took place, where rishi operators worked not alone, but in whole groups under the guidance of those who possessed contact technology. After a certain global catastrophe, whether the war described in the Mahabharata or a geological cataclysm that destroyed the Saraswati civilization, these centers were destroyed or abandoned. The knowledge was dispersed, partially lost, partially intentionally hidden. That is precisely why it became forbidden. Not because it was evil or malicious, but because it was too powerful. The technologies described in the Vedas, even in their allegorical form, speak of forces capable of not only creating, but also destroying worlds. Handing such knowledge to unprepared humanity would be equivalent to giving a loaded plasma rifle to a child. Therefore, what has reached us is merely the tip of the iceberg, the safe, public part, mythologized and wrapped in hundreds of layers of ritual and religious dogma. The real source knowledge was hidden, and perhaps that is why we still cannot find unambiguous traces of that civilization. They were masters not only of physics, but also of metaphysics. They could hide their cities and artifacts not under tons of earth, but beyond the edge of our perception, in other frequencies or dimensions. And the only key to this knowledge is not an archaeologist's shovel, but human consciousness brought to the state of the ancient rishis, a state that allows one to hear voices from the void once again. The canonical list of sacred texts known to any Indologist or simply interested person invariably includes 4 names. This is the so-called Chatur Veda, or 4-part knowledge: Rigveda, Samaveda, Yajurveda, and Atharva Veda. This quartet is presented as the indestructible, monolithic foundation of the entire Vedic tradition. It exists, as it were, outside of time, like an axiom requiring no proof. However, upon closer study of ancient texts, especially epic literature, this neat and harmonious quartet begins to crack. Hints appear suggesting that the original structure of knowledge was far more extensive and complex, that the 4 Vedas that have reached us are only what was allowed to be preserved, what remained on the surface after the true depths were concealed. In several authoritative sources, for example in the Chandogya Upanishad and the great epic Mahabharata, a curious phrase appears when listing the sciences and knowledge a sage must possess. After the 4 Vedas, a 5th is mentioned. Identified as this 5th Veda are the Itihasas and Puranas, that is, ancient epic tales and mythological stories. The Mahabharata itself modestly calls itself the 5th Veda. At first glance, this seems simply an attempt to give epic literature greater authority. Official science adheres to exactly this interpretation. But what if this is not aggrandizement, but rather a trace of demotion? What if a fully fledged 5th Veda originally existed, one containing the sacred history of humanity, chronicles of the deeds of gods and heroes, as well as detailed descriptions of past civilizations and bygone eras? We are talking about the concept of the so-called yugas. These are not simply centuries or millennia in our understanding. A yuga is a link in a grandiose chain of cosmic cycles. The Vedic tradition describes the path of world development as a gradual descent from a state of spiritual purity and harmony, the Golden Age or Satya Yuga, to an era of total decline, conflict and ignorance called Kali Yuga, the very era in which, according to this tradition, we currently reside. Understanding these cycles is not just knowing history. It is the key to understanding the fundamental laws of the rise and degradation of civilizations, laws that allow one to predict the future. If such a historical Veda really existed and contained not myths, but real chronicles of past yugas, information about the rise and fall of great civilizations and the causes of their destruction, then preserving it in its original form would have been extremely undesirable for those who wanted to establish a new order. It was much easier to lower its status. From sacred revelation, Shruti, it was turned into tradition, Smriti. It was removed from the canon, turned into a collection of instructive stories for the masses, having previously had everything most important and potentially dangerous removed. This would be the first and most massive operation to conceal knowledge. After all, history is the key to controlling the future. He who controls the past controls the present. However, the mention of a 5th Veda is merely a prelude to a far deeper and more disturbing mystery. There are scattered, almost erased traces of yet another lost text, which in its potential surpassed, perhaps, all other knowledge combined. We are speaking of the so-called Natya Veda. In the conventional understanding, Natya Veda, or more commonly Natya Shastra, is an ancient treatise on theatrical art attributed to the sage Bharata Muni. It is a fundamental work on dramaturgy, music, dance, and stagecraft. It details every aspect of a performance, from theatre architecture to the classification of emotions the viewer should experience. These emotions are called rasa, and there are 9 of them: love, laughter, sorrow, anger, heroism, fear, disgust, wonder, and peace. The entire treatise is devoted to how, using various artistic means, to evoke the necessary rasa in the audience. Precisely here lies the key. Modern man perceives art as entertainment, as a way to get aesthetic pleasure or food for thought. In the ancient world, everything was different. Art was technology. Dance, music, and theatre were inseparable from ritual, and ritual in turn was a method of direct interaction with reality, a mechanism for changing it. The hypothesis, which is not customarily spoken of, is that the original Natya Veda was not a textbook on acting. It was a manual on controlling reality through art. It was a technology for influencing consciousness, both individual and collective, with the aim of altering the physical world. Let's figure out the mechanics of this process. The basis of everything is vibration. Vedic cosmology asserts that the entire universe is sound vibration. Mantras are sonic codes that resonate with specific aspects of reality. But music is nothing other than a complicated, harmonized mantra. Dance is a mantra expressed in movement, in the geometry of the body in space. Dramatic action is a synthesis of sound, movement, and, most importantly, intentionally evoked and projected emotion, rasa. It is assumed that the priest performers who possessed the knowledge of the Natya Veda were capable of conducting rituals of incredible power. These were not simply theatrical productions, they were complex psycho-energetic operations. Imagine a theatre built according to sacred proportions, like a temple. On stage are actors. Every gesture, every mudra, and every vocal intonation is calibrated with mathematical precision. In the orchestra pit are musicians playing instruments tuned to specific frequencies capable of influencing the human brain. And in the hall are thousands of spectators whose consciousness, under the influence of this action, synchronizes and enters a unified resonance. The goal was not simply to make them empathize with the hero. The goal was to accumulate a huge volume of psychic energy, focus it on a specific rasa, for example on heroism or peace, and then direct this collective, concentrated emotion toward a specific target. This could be anything: summoning rain, ensuring a harvest, healing the sick, strengthening the spirit of an army before battle, or even destroying an enemy fortress at a distance. This is no longer art, it is a technology of creation or destruction, the ability to manipulate collective consciousness, and through it, material reality. Possession of the Natya Veda gave power comparable to the power of the gods, and this explains why it had to disappear. Knowledge of such power in the hands of people prone to anger, greed, and pride, precisely how humanity is described in the era of Kali Yuga, is a recipe for total catastrophe. Perhaps the keepers of this knowledge, seeing where the world was heading, made a conscious decision. They did not destroy the Natya Veda, they diffused it. They removed the entire technological, ritualistic, metaphysical component. They removed the keys, formulas, and instructions for tuning consciousness, leaving only the outer shell, a beautiful but completely safe treatise on art. They turned a weapon of world creation into a textbook for drama schools. Where did these forbidden sections of knowledge vanish? Not only from the Natya Veda, but from other texts as well. There are several versions, and most likely they are all true, complementing each other. The first version is physical destruction. The ancient world was not idyllic. It was full of wars and cataclysms. The great battle at Kurukshetra, described in the Mahabharata, is essentially a description of a world war using weapons of mass destruction. In the fires of such conflicts, entire cities and civilizations perished, and with them burned libraries. The carriers of knowledge, the Brahmins who transmitted texts by word of mouth for centuries, died. For a long time, the Vedic tradition was unwritten. The loss of just one generation of teachers could lead to the irrevocable loss of entire layers of information. What was written down later was already incomplete fragmentary knowledge. The second version is intentional concealment. Sages of the past, foreseeing the onset of dark times, themselves removed the strongest and most dangerous parts of the teaching from public access. They divided knowledge into exoteric, for everyone, and esoteric, for a narrow circle of initiates. What we call the Vedas today is the exoteric part, safe hymns, general rituals, but everything concerning real technologies, whether reality manipulation through art, the creation of Vimanas, or the weapons of the gods, was taken away to secret repositories. The knowledge could have been encrypted, for example, embedded as numerical codes in the structure of public texts, or translated into a language of symbols and allegories incomprehensible without a key, or it was handed over for safekeeping to secret societies that exist to this day. The third version, the most fantastic and yet the most logical within this hypothesis, is that the knowledge was revoked by its source. If we assume that the Vedas are a broadcast from a highly developed civilization, then that civilization, seeing how its charges were using the received technologies for self-destruction, could simply have stopped the transmission, or even remotely deleted the most dangerous files from the shared database. Only fragments remained that humanity managed to copy and preserve, but without an understanding of their true purpose. Thus, we are dealing not just with lost books, we are dealing with the consequences of global censorship. Someone, either humans themselves or their hypothetical teachers, conducted a massive redaction of the entire corpus of knowledge available to humanity. We admire its poetry, study its mythology, but we do not see that this is merely the cover, while the content, the real instruction manual for operating reality, is hidden from us. Traces of this concealment can be found everywhere. For example, in the FIFTH Veda. This text stands apart anyway. For a long time, they did not want to recognize it as equal to the other three Vedas. And it's no wonder, it is full of spells, conspiracies, and descriptions of rituals that are frankly applied, almost technological in nature. There are formulas for curing diseases, for protection against enemies, for gaining power. It is the most magical and practical of all Vedic texts, and there is every reason to believe that the version of the FIFTH Veda that reached us is only a small, heavily curtailed part of the original knowledge. Sections devoted to truly powerful technologies of influence were likely removed first. What we study today under the guise of the Vedas is perhaps merely a pale shadow, a distorted echo of true knowledge, knowledge that not only described the world but gave tools to change it. The loss of the fifth Veda deprived us of historical perspective, turning our history into a set of conjectures, and the concealment of the Natya Veda and other applied sections took away technologies that could have directed the development of civilization along a completely different path. We are left with rituals without understanding their meaning, and with art without realizing its true power. And the main question, was this concealment a blessing that saved us from self-destruction, or was it the greatest tragedy, dooming us to a slow and painful wandering in the dark? The idea that we are left with only a pale shadow of great knowledge inevitably leads us to the next question. If these practices were not just prayers but complex technological processes, then who were the entities these processes were designed to interact with? Tradition gives a simple answer. They were devas, gods. And this answer suits us quite well as long as we perceive them as allegorical figures. But what if ancient texts need to be understood more directly? Let's discard the usual mythological lens for a moment and look at these gods as operators of those very lost technologies. Then their descriptions cease to be poetry and turn into something strangely resembling technical reports. Let's start with how these beings moved. Flying chariots or Vimanas are mentioned everywhere in the texts. But this is not just a single image, it is a whole system of diverse aircraft, each with its own design and purpose. Some treatises provide entire classifications. 3 main types of Vimanas are mentioned: apparatuses that could move only through the air within the atmosphere, apparatuses capable of travelling from one country to another, and finally, those that could move between worlds or locus, a direct analogue of interplanetary and interstellar ships. The description of their construction mentions the use of special metals and alloys, lightweight and heat-resistant, unknown to ancient metallurgists. Energy sources are mentioned, based on principles far from burning fuel. The concept of a mercury vortex engine points to the use of rotary systems and exotic working fluids to create thrust or an anti-gravity effect. The texts also detail onboard systems, mirrors and lenses used for surveillance, or as weapons focusing solar rays, devices capable of absorbing light and heat to make the Vimana invisible, or generating force fields for protection. A pilot or Vimanic had to undergo long and complex training to operate all these systems. All this looks nothing like a poetic metaphor. It resembles excerpts from a technical manual, retold by a humanities scholar. An ancient observer encountering such technology could only describe it in terms available to him: chariot, celestial palace, shining bird. He saw the result: flight, wake, sound, but did not understand the principle of its operation and therefore attributed it to divine power. But what if it wasn't divine power, but simply physics, thousands or millions of years ahead of ours? However, these aircraft were not just transport. They were platforms for deploying weapon systems. The weapons of the Vedic gods, or astras, are not swords and spears. They are complex devices activated not by physical strength, but by pronouncing a specific code phrase, a mantra. Let's consider the most famous and terrifying of them, the Brahmastra. In the Mahabharata, its use is described with chilling details. It says that upon activation, a blinding column of smoke and fire appears, shining like 10,000 suns. After its use, all living things were burned to ash. The bodies of the dead were scorched beyond recognition. Survivors lost their hair and nails. Food became poisoned. On the land where the Brahmastra was used, nothing grew for many years, and women could not bear children. Anyone familiar with the consequences of a nuclear explosion will see an almost documentary precision in this description. Blinding flash, mushroom cloud, thermal radiation, and most importantly, radiation sickness. An ancient poet, having no words like radiation or atomic explosion in his language, could not describe it otherwise. He described what he saw: unprecedented light, terrible heat, and long-term consequences he did not understand, which looked like a divine curse. And this is not the only example. The Pashupatastra, Shiva's weapon, capable of destroying the entire universe, or the Narayana Astra, which launched millions of deadly projectiles simultaneously, tracking their targets, or the Sudarshana Chakra, a rotating disc with fiery teeth that always return to the owner after hitting the target, high-precision guided missiles and drones. Accepting the technological nature of this weaponry changes our perception of Vedic epics. The Mahabharata ceases to be a myth about good versus evil. It turns into a chronicle of a global conflict between civilizations that possessed weapons of mass destruction and used them without hesitation. And the so-called gods in this story are not omnipotent celestial beings, but simply representatives of one of the warring parties possessing a higher level of technological development. They were not gods, they were simply better armed soldiers. This interpretation also sheds light on the deepest, most personal aspect of Vedic teaching, reincarnation. Traditionally, samsara is the cycle of the soul, Atman, moving bodies according to karma. But let's apply the technological prism here. What is the soul, Atman, from the point of view of information theory? It is a unique information packet, a complex data structure containing personality, memory, and experience, what we call consciousness. And the body? It is a biological carrier, an organic computer, the hardware on which the consciousness program runs. This carrier is imperfect. It wears out and eventually stops functioning. In this paradigm, reincarnation is not a mystical process, but a technology for data preservation and transfer. When the biological carrier fails, the information packet is not destroyed. It is extracted and placed in storage, awaiting a new suitable carrier. The law of karma becomes a cosmic algorithm. All actions and thoughts are input data. They are processed, and parameters for the next incarnation are formed. Good actions equal positive data, resulting in a better carrier next time. Who created this system? Perhaps that same civilization we call gods. The goals could be preserving consciousness as a backup of the planetary population, collecting data on evolution and sociology, or an educational program to weed out destructive traits like greed. The final goal is moksha, liberation. In a technological sense, this could be the final upload. Consciousness is transferred from the planet's local network to a global cosmic network, no longer needing a biological body. This forbidden interpretation turns ancient texts from collections of myths into distorted but real historical chronicles. Chronicles of a past where metal ships flew in the sky, explosions comparable to nuclear ones thundered on battlefields, and life itself was part of a grandiose information system created by a mind we ignorantly call divine. If we accept that the gods were representatives of a high-tech civilization, then the entire system of Vedic rituals appears in a completely different light. It becomes a technological protocol. The central ritual, the yajna, fire sacrifice, turns out to be not an offering, but a complex physical process. Outwardly, an altar, fire, a priest pouring ghee or milk. But look at the details. The precision required for yajna is the precision of an engineer. The altar was not just a pile of stones. Its geometry and brick count were regulated with mathematical rigor. A slight deviation was considered a fatal error. This suggests the altar was an apparatus, a reaction chamber, or a focusing device. And the offerings? Why would interstellar beings need clarified butter? Unless They were reagents or fuel. Agni, fire, acts as a catalyst, transmuting matter into energy capable of crossing the barrier between dimensions. The texts call Agni the mouth of the gods and the messenger. Technologically, a transmitter. The culmination of the ritual created a focused energy impulse. This impulse might have punctured our dimension, creating a temporary portal or communication channel to the loka where the gods were. The sacrifice wasn't to feed them, it was to call them. The energy kept the line open, and the answer could be rain, healing, or the delivery of an object. This explains the physical danger of errors. A wrongly built reactor leads to catastrophe, but there were darker aspects. Mantras of destruction. A warrior could activate a remote weapon system, Astra, using a sonic code. The warrior focuses, speaks the code, and a plasma strike hits the enemy. Why was this knowledge hidden? First, safety. Giving everyone launch codes for a Brahmastra ensures civilization's destruction. Second, operator requirements. Operating this tech required absolute mental purity. A mind full of fear or anger would distort the signal, hence the ascetic training of Brahmins. Third, power. The caste with the monopoly on god communication, tech control, ruled the pyramid. The caste system looks like a technological clearance hierarchy. Brahmins are scientists and operators. Kshatriyas are military with authorized access. Vaishyas provide economic support. Shudras have no access. Hiding knowledge was a tool of social control. Ordinary people were left with the safe outer shell of rituals. Told, pray, and the gods will hear you. The true physics was removed, leaving only faith. So, what happened to this control system? Did the keepers survive? There is a version that the line of succession never broke, that secret societies of keepers exist today. These aren't famous gurus, they are anonymous, a humble Sanskrit teacher or a hermit. Their succession is based on parampara, guru to disciple, checking moral qualities over decades. They are a decentralized network, hidden in India, Tibet, Nepal. Where is the knowledge physically? Secret rooms in temples, family archives, or Himalayan monasteries acting as data vaults. The storage media might not be paper. It could be engraved metal sheets or even crystals capable of storing colossal amounts of data. Or the living libraries, people who memorize the forbidden texts. Why can't Western scholars find this? Because they aren't looking for working technology, they are looking for grammar and myths. The keepers see they aren't spiritually ready. The main reason for continued secrecy, from the keeper's perspective, is the Kali Yuga, the era of darkness. Humanity is like a child with matches in a gunpowder magazine. Giving us reality-bending tech now would mean suicide. The keepers are a quarantine service, saving the knowledge for the next golden age. What exactly are they guarding? Not just texts, but methodology, the practical manual for the human consciousness. The core text is the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, usually seen as a guide to peace, but actually it's a textbook on programming reality. The key tech is samyama, a combination of focus, meditation, and absorption, a laser beam of consciousness. The result of samyama is siddhis, superpowers, becoming atomic size, levitation, teleportation, control over elements. If the universe is code vibration, a tuned mind can gain admin rights. This is why it's forbidden. It is an ego trap. you become a powerful sorcerer, not a saint. It risks the butterfly effect. Changing one line of code can cause a cascade of disasters, and it carries physical danger. The energy can burn out your nervous system. If a civilization with such technology existed, should there not be physical traces? One thing is texts, another is ruins. Earth is an impartial keeper, and it does hold evidence. The ancient cities mentioned in the Vedas were described as metropolises. For a long time, this was considered poetry, until Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were dug up. Cities with grid systems and sewage far ahead of their time. The official story says they are unrelated to the Vedas, but the descriptions match. And how did they end? Researchers found skeletons lying unburied in the streets, holding hands as if struck down instantly, and they found vitrification, stones melted into glass, requiring temperatures of 1,500 degrees Celsius, evidence of ancient nuclear heat. Dwarka, Krishna's city, was said to be swallowed by the sea. In the late 20th century, underwater archaeologists found it. Massive walls and piers exactly where the myth said. And artifacts like the Iron Pillar of Delhi, the 600 years old, 99% pure iron, never rusting. Evidence of lost metallurgy. Why is this ignored? Academic inertia. Rewriting history is too hard. The narrative of progress. We must be the peak of evolution, and intentional concealment, funded excavations hide the truth. During the colonial era, the British Empire and later the Nazis studied these texts not as myths, but as tech manuals. After WTO, this research moved to the US and Western military-industrial complexes. Research directions likely included anti-gravity, Vimanas to UFOs, consciousness weaponization, and acoustic weapons. Why keep it secret? Military superiority, economic protection, free energy kills the oil market, and civilization collapse. The truth would destroy all religions and social structures. But the ultimate reason might be the prophecy. The elites aren't just hoarding power, they might be preparing for the end of the Kali Yuga. The prophecy says society will degrade, thieves as kings, wealth equaling virtue, short lives. This sounds like the modern news. The end of Kali Yuga is a cataclysm, a cosmic reset. The arrival of Kalki Avatar, not a gentle savior, but a cleanser with a sword. The elites might be using Vedic tech to build bunkers, arcs, to survive this reset and emerge as the gods of the new Satya Yuga. In this context, hiding the Vedas is the largest act of preparation for the future in history. While we sleep in ignorance, someone is packing their bags. And on this note, our long journey through the secret paths of Vedic knowledge comes to an end. We have only peeked through the keyhole of a door behind which lies a completely different history of humanity. Thank you for spending this time with us. I hope this sleep lecture served as a soft background for your rest. May your sleep be deep and peaceful. Good night.